Imagine trying to convince your commanding officer that the army doctor just deliberately infected you with a potentially fatal disease. Now imagine he responds by checking a logbook and confirming, yes, that's correct. It's Tuesday, variolation day, perfectly routine. The Prussian military medical establishment didn't hide their experimental protocols. They published them, refined them, and defended them as enlightened scientific progress. Tonight we're examining the medical wards where soldiers lined up for procedures with documented fatality rates, where informed consent meant you're in the army now, and where the gap between healthcare and human experimentation was measured in paperwork rather than ethics. Your body, His Majesty's laboratory. Settle in. The medical barracks smelled like fear before it smelled like anything else. That particular combination of cold stone, lye soap, and something underneath that no one wanted to identify. The new recruits shuffled in before dawn, breath visible in the chill, shoulders hunched against more than just the temperature. They had heard things. Every regiment had its whisper network. Older soldiers, the ones who had survived their first year, would find quiet corners and pass along warnings to the fresh meat. The warnings always sounded the same, regiment to regiment, garrison to garrison, generation to generation. The doctors would scratch disease into your arm. They would put you in wards where men shook with fever in long rows, sweating through their linens, some of them dying while the surgeons took notes. The treatments were worse than the diseases. Your teeth would fall out. Your jaw would rot. Your mind would go soft. Officers heard these whispers and dismissed them with the comfortable certainty of men who had never slept in an enlisted barracks. Peasant superstition. The ignorant fears of men who couldn't read and didn't understand modern medicine. The Army's doctors were the finest in Europe, educated at the best universities, practitioners of the most advanced techniques the Enlightenment had to offer. The idea that they would deliberately harm the very soldiers they were charged with keeping healthy was absurd. Hysterical. The kind of paranoid fantasy that spread through populations too uneducated to know better. The officers were wrong. Not partially wrong. Not wrong in spirit, but right in some technical sense. Wrong in every way that mattered. The whispers weren't distortions of reality. They were accurate descriptions of documented medical protocols approved at the highest levels of military command, recorded in logs that still exist in archives today. The doctors did scratch disease into soldiers' arms. The fever wards were real. The treatments did make men's jaws rot and their teeth fall out. Every paranoid fantasy the recruits traded in terrified whispers corresponded to an official procedure with a Latin name and a bureaucratic paper trail. The Prussian army didn't just treat its soldiers as cannon fodder. That would have been almost understandable, the grim mathematics of 18th century warfare. Instead, it treated them as something more unsettling. Laboratory animals. Test subjects. Data points in ongoing medical research programs that would advance careers, generate publications, and occasionally, as a side effect, produce genuine medical knowledge. The death rate for the standard smallpox prevention procedure ran between 2 and 3%. Not of the enemy. Of the Prussian army's own soldiers, killed by Prussian army doctors in the name of protecting the army's strength. This was considered acceptable, progressive, even. The alternative was worse. The military medical establishment argued, and they weren't entirely wrong. But being partly right about the statistics didn't make the fundamental horror any less horrifying. Those recruits shivering in the medical barracks at dawn were about to experience the cutting edge of Enlightenment medicine. They hadn't consented to this. The concept of consent, as we understand it, hadn't been invented yet. Their bodies belonged to the king. Everything that followed was paperwork. The whispers were right. The conspiracy was real. And it was so much worse than anyone dared to say out loud. The procedure began with a lancet. A small blade, deceptively delicate, the kind of instrument that might be used for anything from bloodletting to minor surgery. In this case, it would be used to make a series of shallow cuts in the upper arm, just deep enough to draw blood, arranged in a neat row like tally marks counting down to something. Then came the material. Harvested from the pustules of a soldier currently suffering from smallpox, preferably in the optimal stage of the disease, when the blisters were ripe but not yet crusting over. The surgeon would collect this biological matter, this concentrated essence of one of humanity's most devastating diseases, and work it into the fresh cuts with careful, practiced motions. The technique required precision. Too shallow, and the inoculation wouldn't take. Too deep, and the wound might become infected with something worse than the intended disease. The recruits called this being scratched. The medical term was variolation, from variola, the Latin name for smallpox. The soldiers' version was more accurate. They were being scratched with death, and whether they lived through the next few weeks was largely a matter of luck. The logic, viewed from a sufficient distance, made a kind of terrible sense. Smallpox was endemic in 18th century Europe. Virtually everyone who lived long enough would encounter the virus eventually. When they did, roughly 30% of them would die. In an army where men lived in close quarters and marched through populations where the disease circulated freely, outbreaks could destroy entire regiments more effectively than enemy action. A commander who lost 1,000 men to smallpox had lost those men just as surely as if they had been cut down by cavalry. Variolation offered an alternative. By deliberately infecting soldiers with a controlled dose of the virus, introduced through the skin rather than the respiratory system, doctors could induce a milder form of the disease. Most men would develop a localized infection, suffer through a week or two of fever and discomfort, and emerge immune for life. The cost was a death rate of 2 to 3%, sometimes higher if the technique was sloppy or the viral material was particularly virulent. Frederick the Great endorsed the program personally. The monarch who modernized the Prussian Army, who transformed it into the most efficient military machine in Europe, considered the systematic inoculation of his troops an essential component of military readiness. He was not wrong about the mathematics. A 3% peacetime mortality rate was preferable to losing a third of an army during a campaign. Wars had been lost to smaller margins. The variolation wards were exactly what the whispers described. Long rooms filled with rows of cots, each one occupied by a soldier in some stage of artificial smallpox infection. The air was thick with the smell of fever sweat, that particular sour heaviness that accumulates when dozens of human bodies are fighting off the same disease simultaneously. Some men shivered despite the warmth. Others burned, their skin hot enough to feel radiant from across the room. Medical orderlies moved between the rows, noting temperatures, checking pulses, recording deaths. Because men did die. That was the cost of the program, documented in military medical logs with bureaucratic precision. Recruit Johannes Keller, age 19, inoculated April 3rd, died April 17th. Recruit Wilhelm Braun, age 22, inoculated April 5th, died April 12th. The logs listed causes of death when the surgeons could determine them. Overwhelming infection. Secondary pneumonia. Systemic failure. Sometimes the cause was simply noted as variolation, as if the procedure itself were the disease. The survivors emerged immune. They could march through plague-ridden cities without fear, tend dying comrades without risk, fight in campaigns where smallpox ravaged the enemy ranks. They had been scratched, and they had lived, and their survival had been purchased with the deaths of the men whose names now appeared only in medical logs. This was the first conspiracy that wasn't a conspiracy at all. It was policy. Official, documented, approved policy, complete with guidelines for optimal technique and statistical projections for acceptable casualties. The recruits who whispered about doctors scratching disease into their arms were simply describing what happened. The only thing they got wrong was thinking anyone cared that they knew. Syphilis followed armies the way carrion birds followed battlefields. Where soldiers went, brothels sprouted. Where brothels operated, the great pox spread. By some estimates, infection rates in 18th-century European armies ran as high as 15% at any given time. An army that couldn't control syphilis wasn't just dealing with a moral problem. It was dealing with a strategic one. Soldiers weakened by progressive disease made poor fighters. Officers incapacitated by tertiary symptoms made poor commanders. Something had to be done. The something that 18th century medicine offered was mercury. The metal had been used to treat syphilis since the disease first appeared in Europe in the late 15th century, and 200 years of experience had established a clear pattern. Mercury did something to the infection. Men treated with it often showed improvement, at least temporarily. The fact that mercury also did terrible things to the patients themselves was considered, in the careful language of medical discourse, a necessary trade-off. The soldiers who whispered that the cure was worse than the disease were not exaggerating. Mercury toxicity manifested in stages, each one worse than the last. First came the salivation, excessive production of saliva that left men constantly drooling, unable to eat or speak normally. Then came the loose teeth, the gums softening and retreating as the mercury accumulated in bone tissue. Finally came the jaw itself, the bone dying and rotting in the mouth, a condition later generations would call phossy jaw when they encountered it in match factory workers. The smell was indescribable. The appearance was worse. Military doctors knew all of this. They documented it meticulously, and they continued administering mercury because the alternative was watching syphilis progress to its final stages, where it attacked the brain and the heart and reduced men to shambling, demented wrecks. The choice was not between a good option and a bad option. It was between different varieties of horror. But knowing that mercury worked in some sense was not the same as knowing how to use it optimally. What compound worked best? Mercury chloride, mercury sulfide, mercury vapor? What dosage produced the best ratio of symptom reduction to side effects? What method of administration, oral ingestion, topical application, fumigation chambers, achieved the highest efficacy? These questions demanded answers. Answers demanded research. Research demanded subjects. The Prussian military medical establishment had access to exactly the population it needed. thousands of syphilitic soldiers, a captive group that couldn't refuse treatment, couldn't leave the study, couldn't seek care elsewhere. Different compounds were administered to different patients. Dosages were varied systematically. Some soldiers received treatment immediately upon diagnosis. Others were observed without intervention, their disease progression documented as a baseline against which treatments could be measured. Control groups. That phrase sounds almost modern, almost ethical, the kind of rigorous methodology that separates real science from anecdote. But control groups in this context meant soldiers deliberately left untreated, their suffering allowed to continue and worsen, so that doctors could quantify exactly how much better the mercury-poisoned patients were doing. The men in the control groups were not told they were receiving no treatment. They were not asked if they wanted to participate in a comparative study. They were simply assigned, by some medical officer making notes in a ledger, to the group that would demonstrate what happened when syphilis ran its course. The correspondence between military medical officers discussed all of this in the measured language of professional discourse. What level of mercury-induced disfigurement was acceptable given the alternative? How should doctors weigh the loss of a soldier's teeth and jaw against the loss of his mind to tertiary syphilis? These were optimization problems to be solved through careful data collection and rational analysis. The soldiers themselves were variables in an equation. The whispers in the barracks weren't wrong. The doctors were testing treatments that rotted men's faces. The only thing the whispers didn't capture was how systematically it was all being done. Battlefield surgery in the 18th century was not surgery in any modern sense. It was butchery performed under impossible conditions, a desperate race against shock and blood loss and the onset of infection that would kill more soldiers than any blade or bullet. The wounded man was held down, or if he was lucky, given enough alcohol to dull the worst of what was coming. The surgeon worked with speed as his primary virtue. A good amputation, from first cut to final suture, could be completed in under a minute. Speed was mercy. Speed was survival. Speed could only be achieved through practice. The rumors that circulated through the ranks held that military surgeons used the wounded as training dummies, that they practiced their cuts on men who might have been saved with simpler treatment, that the battlefield was not just a place where surgery happened, but a place where surgery was learned, one screaming patient at a time. These rumors were partly wrong and entirely true in the way that the worst rumors usually are. Military surgeons did not, for the most part, inflict unnecessary amputations purely for practice. The wounded who reached the surgical tents generally needed exactly the brutal interventions they received. A shattered limb in an era before antibiotics was a death sentence waiting to happen. Removing it quickly, before infection set in, was often the only chance a man had. The surgeons who cut and sawed and sutured were not villains. They were practitioners of a primitive art, working with inadequate tools under impossible conditions, trying to save what lives could be saved. But practice did happen. New techniques were developed and tested on real patients in real time. When a surgeon wondered whether a different angle of approach might produce a cleaner stump, he tried it on the next suitable patient. When one method of tying off blood vessels seemed to result in fewer cases of secondary hemorrhage, it was adopted and its results documented. When a promising innovation failed, that failure was noted in case reports that would inform future attempts. The line between treatment and experiment, never clearly drawn in this era, was invisible on the battlefield. The documentation was remarkable in its clinical detachment. Case studies described wound presentations, surgical interventions, and outcomes with careful attention to detail. Soldier A, musket wound to the upper arm, bone shattered, amputation performed at the shoulder using technique B, patient died of hemorrhage within 3 hours. Soldier C, similar wound, similar presentation, amputation performed using technique D, patient survived. The implicit conclusion was obvious. Technique D was better. The explicit cost, 2 men treated as experimental subjects without their knowledge or consent, was not considered a cost at all. What makes this difficult to condemn outright is the genuine progress that emerged. Military surgery did improve over the course of the 18th century. Mortality rates from amputation did decline. Techniques were refined, procedures were standardized, knowledge accumulated. The men who screamed on operating tables contributed, in their agony, to a body of knowledge that would save lives in future wars. Whether this justified treating them as experimental subjects is a question that didn't occur to the surgeons asking it. The medical officers conducting this research were not monsters by the standards of their time. They were professionals advancing their field through the only methods available to them. They had access to damaged bodies in large numbers, under conditions that permitted systematic observation and documentation. It would have seemed wasteful not to learn from the opportunity. That this framing treats human suffering as an opportunity to be exploited is precisely the problem that later generations would recognize and attempt to address. But in the moment, it simply seemed like good science. Some regiments sickened at twice the rate of others. This was observable fact, documented in medical logs that tracked morbidity by unit across campaigns and garrisons. The question was why? Were some commanders better at maintaining camp hygiene? Were some soldiers simply hardier than others, their constitutions more resistant to the diseases that ravaged military populations? Or was something else at work? Military medical officers suspected that something else was at work, and they set out to discover what. The method they chose was elegant in its simplicity and horrifying in its implications. Different regiments would receive different prophylactic treatments. Some would receive the standard interventions then in use. Some would receive experimental variations. Some would receive nothing at all. Then the disease rates would be compared, and conclusions would be drawn. This was comparative research before the term existed. Population-level studies using military units as sample groups. The soldiers in these regiments were not informed that they were participating in research. They were not asked whether they wanted to be test subjects. They were simply assigned to their units, subjected to whatever protocols those units happened to receive, and their subsequent health outcomes were recorded in logs that would eventually find their way into medical publications. The men who received no prophylaxis were control groups. That clinical phrase obscures what it actually meant. These were soldiers deliberately left vulnerable to diseases that might kill them, so that doctors could establish a baseline against which other interventions could be measured. If Regiment A received treatment and lost 3% of its men to typhus, while Regiment B received nothing and lost 8%, then the treatment could be credited with saving 5% of the treated soldiers. The calculation required the untreated soldiers to suffer and die. The diseases being studied were not obscure. Typhus, dysentery, camp fever, the whole catalog of infections that accompanied military life. These were killers on a massive scale, responsible for more military deaths than combat in most 18th century wars. finding ways to prevent them was a legitimate medical priority. The methods used to pursue that priority were something else entirely. Medical logs from this era record disease progression with the careful attention to detail that characterizes good scientific observation. Onset of symptoms, progression through stages, complications, outcomes. The language is clinical, detached, the kind of prose that transforms human suffering into data. Soldier Schmidt presented with fever on day 3, progressed to delirium by day 7, expired on day 12. The word expired carries particular weight in this context, as if the soldier were a subscription or coupon rather than a person. The men who whispered that their regiment was being treated differently from others were not paranoid. They were observant. The differences were real, the reasons were deliberate, and the outcomes were being tracked by medical officers whose careers would benefit from the resulting publications. Whether the whispering soldiers understood that they were data points in someone's dissertation is unclear. What is clear is that no one thought to ask their permission. When a man took the king's shilling, he was entering into a contract. The terms were not complex. He agreed to serve for a specified period, to follow orders, to fight when called upon, to accept military discipline, including physical punishment for infractions. In exchange, he received pay, uniforms, housing of a sort, and the dubious honor of serving his sovereign. What the contract did not mention, because it did not need to mention, was what would happen to his body. An 18th century soldier's body belonged to the state. This was not a metaphor or an exaggeration, but a legal reality with practical consequences. Military regulations gave commanding officers absolute authority over their men's physical persons. A soldier could be flogged for disobedience, executed for desertion, sent into battle with full knowledge that death was likely. His body was a military asset to be deployed as the service required. Medical authority operated within this framework. When a military surgeon ordered a procedure, refusal was not an option. Not practically, because a soldier who refused medical treatment could be court-martialed for disobeying a lawful order. Not philosophically, because the concept of a patient's right to refuse treatment had not yet been invented. The body that took the king's shilling had agreed, in that moment, to whatever the king's doctors decided to do with it. Informed consent, the principle that a patient must understand and agree to a medical intervention before it is performed, would not become a recognized concept until the 20th century. In the 18th, the very phrase would have been nonsensical. Inform the patient of what? Ask consent for what reason? The doctor knew best. The doctor's authority was absolute. The patient's preferences were irrelevant. This legal and philosophical vacuum made soldiers ideal subjects for medical research. They could not refuse. They could not leave. They could not seek alternative treatment elsewhere. They were housed together in large numbers, making population-level studies practical. Their records were maintained systematically, making long-term follow-up possible. Their movements were controlled, making them easy to track. Every characteristic that made them effective military assets also made them effective experimental subjects. Other populations served similar functions. Prisoners whose bodies belonged to the state through a different mechanism. Orphans whose bodies belonged to whoever housed them. The poor in public hospitals who traded their bodily autonomy for free medical care. But soldiers were special. They were numerous, they were young and relatively healthy. and their complete subordination to military authority was explicit and unquestioned. The officers who oversaw this system did not subject themselves to it. When an officer required medical care, he received treatment appropriate to his condition, not experiments designed to advance scientific knowledge. The protocols that applied to enlisted men, the variolation, the mercury trials, the comparative exposure studies, were not applied to their social betters. Class distinction, invisible in so many aspects of military life, became perfectly visible in the medical barracks. The peasant soldiers who whispered about what happened in those barracks were not only describing real procedures, they were describing procedures that would never, under any circumstances, be performed on the men giving the orders. A military medical appointment was a career opportunity. The surgeon who secured a position with a regiment gained access to something that civilian practitioners could only dream of: patients. Hundreds of them. Thousands in larger commands. Young, mostly healthy subjects who could be observed, treated, and documented over extended periods. A living laboratory, wearing uniforms and following orders. The academic structure of 18th century medicine required publication. Reputation was built through contributions to the medical literature, case studies, and treatises that demonstrated expertise and advanced knowledge. The surgeons who served in military appointments understood that their positions offered advantages their civilian colleagues lacked. They had subjects. They had documentation systems. They had time. All they needed was the willingness to use what they had. The publications that emerged from military medical practice were substantial. Treatises on the treatment of camp diseases, with detailed case studies drawn from regimental populations. Comparative analyses of surgical techniques, documented through outcomes tracked across hundreds of procedures. Studies of prophylactic interventions, with control groups and experimental groups and careful statistical analysis. The science was often genuinely rigorous. The ethics were absent entirely. Specific careers can be traced through the military medical literature. Johann Georg Zimmermann, physician to Frederick the Great, built his reputation partly on observations made among military populations. Lorenz Heister, whose surgical textbook became a standard reference throughout Europe, drew on military experience for his most detailed case studies. The path from regimental surgeon to prominent physician often ran through the bodies of enlisted men whose names appeared only as initials in published case reports. Access to subjects was understood as a professional advantage. When medical officers corresponded with colleagues, they mentioned their access to research populations the way a natural philosopher might mention access to a good telescope. It was a resource, a tool for producing knowledge, a fortunate circumstance that would allow important work to proceed. The fact that this resource consisted of human beings who had not consented to being studied was not worth mentioning because it was not considered relevant. The knowledge produced through this system circulated internationally. Prussian military medical publications were read in Paris and London and Vienna. Techniques developed through experimentation on Prussian soldiers were adopted by other armies and eventually by civilian medicine. The medical advances of the Enlightenment, celebrated in histories of science, were built in part on foundations that later generations would find appalling. This does not mean the advances were worthless. Knowledge is knowledge, whatever its origins. The techniques that reduced surgical mortality, the prophylactic measures that controlled epidemic disease, the treatments that slowed the progression of syphilis, all of these produced genuine benefits for subsequent patients. The men whose suffering generated this knowledge did not consent to contribute. They did not receive credit. They did not benefit from the advances their bodies made possible. They were, in the final analysis, raw material processed into publications. The doctoral dissertations that launched medical careers in the 18th century often thanked patrons and mentors. They did not thank the soldiers who served as subjects. It would not have occurred to anyone that thanks were owed. Prussia was not unusual. This is perhaps the most important and most uncomfortable point. The practices documented in Prussian military medical records were not Prussian innovations. They were European standards. Every major military power conducted similar programs. The Prussians were simply more systematic, more bureaucratic, more thorough in their documentation. They were German about it, and the records survive. The British Navy conducted what might be the most famous medical experiment of the era, though it is rarely framed in those terms. When James Lind tested citrus fruits against other proposed treatments for scurvy in 1747, he was conducting a comparative trial on sailors who had not consented to participate. Some received citrus. Some received vinegar. Some received cider. Some received seawater. The experiment was brilliantly designed, a landmark in the history of evidence-based medicine. It was also performed on men who had no choice in the matter, who could not refuse to participate, and some of whom received treatments known to be useless so that their continued suffering could demonstrate a point. French military hospitals served similar functions. The massive casualties of Louis XIV's wars created patient populations that French surgeons studied with systematic attention. Comparative records of treatment outcomes, analyses of wound types and their prognoses, documentation of which interventions produced better results. The French were particularly interested in gunshot wounds, given how many of them their wars produced. The soldiers who provided the data were not consulted. Austrian military medicine developed along parallel lines. The Habsburg armies maintained medical establishments that conducted research alongside treatment, using the steady flow of sick and wounded soldiers as a resource for advancing knowledge. Russian military doctors, trained partly in Western European traditions, implemented similar programs as the Russian army modernized in the 18th century. The international medical community shared findings freely. A technique developed in a Prussian military hospital might be published in a German medical journal, translated into French, discussed in British Medical Society meetings, and adopted by Austrian surgeons, all within a few years. The military medical establishments of Europe formed a kind of distributed research network, each contributing observations and experiments, all drawing on the same fundamental resource: captive populations of soldiers whose consent was neither sought nor required. Prussia's reputation was not for cruelty but for efficiency. When other nations studied Prussian military methods, they looked at medical services alongside tactics and logistics. The systematic approach to soldier health, including the variolation programs and the disease prevention measures, was considered a competitive advantage. An army that lost fewer men to disease could field larger forces for longer campaigns. The experimental programs that produced this knowledge were part of what made Prussia formidable. This international dimension matters because it demonstrates that the problem was not individual bad actors or national peculiarities. It was a system, a continent-wide system in which military populations were understood by everyone who thought about the matter to be available for medical research. The soldiers who whispered in Prussian barracks had counterparts in every army in Europe, whispering the same fears facing the same realities. The conspiracy was not Prussian. It was Enlightenment. The 19th century did not bring reform. If anything, it brought intensification. The growth of European colonial empires created new populations of subjects. The development of more sophisticated medical science created new categories of experiments. The fundamental principle that military bodies belonged to the state and could be used as the state saw fit remained unchallenged. Colonial troops provided particularly useful research populations. African soldiers serving in European colonial armies were subjected to experiments on tropical diseases, tests of prophylactic drugs, studies of physiological differences that European doctors believed existed between races. Indian troops in British service participated in trials of treatments for diseases endemic to the subcontinent. The logic was always the same. These men were available. They could not refuse. Their suffering could produce useful knowledge. The First World War brought innovations that even the 18th century could not have imagined. Psychological experiments on shell-shocked soldiers, studies of what happened to the human mind under industrial warfare, chemical weapons exposure research, tracking the effects of mustard gas and phosgene on human tissue. Some of this was treatment research, attempts to help men who had been damaged by the war. Some of it was weapons research, attempts to understand how better to damage men in future wars. The distinction was not always clear to the men being studied. Between the wars, military medical establishments continued their work with increasing sophistication. Nazi Germany would eventually take these principles to their logical and horrifying conclusion, but the German military medical establishment that participated in concentration camp experiments was staffed partly by men who had begun their careers in legitimate military medicine. The path from 18th century variolation programs to 20th century atrocities was not a sharp break, but a gradual intensification. Each generation built on the methods of the one before. The aftermath of the Second World War brought the first serious attempts at reform. The Nuremberg Code, adopted in 1947, established principles of informed consent that seemed obvious in retrospect, but had never been formally articulated. The very existence of the code was an admission that previous practice had been unacceptable. Its provisions requiring voluntary consent, requiring that subjects be informed of risks, requiring that experiments have scientific validity, each one addressed a specific historical abuse. But even Nuremberg did not end military medical experimentation without consent. The United States, in the decades following the war, conducted radiation experiments on soldiers, psychological experiments, drug trials. The CIA's MKUltra program administered hallucinogens to subjects without their knowledge. Operation Whitecoat used conscientious objectors as test subjects for biological weapons research. The subjects were technically volunteers, but the line between volunteering and being voluntold in a military context was blurry at best. The pattern kept repeating because the underlying logic kept making sense. Soldiers were available. They were young and healthy. They were subject to military discipline. They could be tracked and documented. Every argument that made them ideal subjects in the 18th century remained valid in the 20th. What changed, slowly and incompletely, was the willingness to acknowledge that being an ideal subject did not mean being a legitimate one. Modern military medical ethics codes are remarkably specific. They prohibit experiments without informed consent. They require that subjects understand the risks of participation. They mandate review boards to evaluate proposed research. They establish that military personnel retain rights to their own bodies even while serving. Each provision reads like a closing of a barn door, an official acknowledgement that the horse escaped long ago and caused considerable damage in the process. The specificity is telling. Broad principles would have been easier to articulate. Instead, the codes enumerate particular prohibitions in exhaustive detail. No exposure to pathogens without consent. No experimental treatments disguised as standard care. No use of military authority to compel participation. No control groups left untreated for comparison. Each rule addresses a specific historical practice. Each practice was, at one point, considered acceptable. The true conspiracy was not that individual doctors did terrible things. Individual doctors did do terrible things, but they did them within a system designed to produce the results it produced. The military medical establishment was built to generate experimental subjects. The paperwork was already there. The authority structures were already in place. The captive populations were already available. All that was required was the willingness to use what the system offered. For centuries, serving your country meant more than risking death in battle. It meant offering your body for uses you would never know about. It meant being scratched with disease, dosed with poison, exposed to pathogens, left untreated, documented, and filed. It meant being a data point in someone's career advancement, a line item in a medical log, a contribution to human knowledge that no one would ever credit you for. The gentleman's agreement among military medical professionals was not to discuss this openly. Not because it was secret, but because it was unremarkable. Of course, armies used their soldiers for research. How else was military medicine supposed to advance? The questions that modern ethics would raise, questions about consent and autonomy and human dignity, simply did not arise because the framework for asking them did not exist. Soldiers were not autonomous individuals with inherent rights. They were resources to be managed. The whispers in the barracks were right all along. The frightened recruits who traded rumors about doctors scratching disease into their arms, about wards where men died while surgeons took notes, about treatments that rotted your jaw, they were not spreading paranoid fantasies. They were describing the system they lived in with accuracy that officers refused to acknowledge and historians would take centuries to confirm. The buildings are gone. The surgeons are long dead. The soldiers who suffered through variolation wards and mercury treatments and battlefield experiments have left no descendants who remember their names. But the echoes persist. In the specificity of modern ethics codes and the careful protocols governing military medical research, in the institutional memory of what happens when bodies are treated as military assets without remainder. We know what informed consent means now because we learned what happened without it. The lesson cost more than anyone was willing to count. The bill was paid in soldiers who thought they were paranoid but were simply paying attention. Picture it. A massive wooden horse, gleaming under the Mediterranean sun, left abandoned on the beach by retreating Greeks. Inside, the bravest warriors of the Aegean crouch in the darkness, breathing through their teeth, waiting for Trojans foolish enough to wheel this obvious trap through their own gates. It's a wonderful image. Cinematic. The problem is that it almost certainly never happened. The story asks us to believe that a city which had successfully resisted the greatest military coalition of the Bronze Age for 10 years suddenly lost all capacity for basic suspicion. That after a decade of bloodshed, treachery, and divine meddling, the Trojans looked at an enormous wooden structure left by their enemies and thought, "What a lovely gift. Let's bring it inside immediately." The ancient Greeks themselves would have found this insulting, and they invented the story. Here's what the romantic narrative conveniently obscures. Capturing a walled city in the ancient world was never about cleverness. It was about arithmetic. Specifically, the arithmetic of calories consumed versus calories stored. Every siege in history has ended the same way, through the grinding, unglamorous mathematics of starvation. The walls don't fall. The people behind them do. Troy had walls that would make a modern military engineer weep with envy. Thick, angled, reinforced, positioned on high ground with clear sightlines in every direction. The Greeks couldn't breach them. They couldn't scale them. They couldn't tunnel beneath them without being detected. For 10 years, they tried every tactical approach available to Bronze Age warfare, and for 10 years, those walls held. So what actually broke Troy? The same thing that broke every fortified city from Alesia to Leningrad. The slow, patient, invisible siege weapon called hunger. The wooden horse makes for better poetry. But the truth is written in emptied granaries and echoing cisterns, in the hollow cheeks of defenders who hadn't eaten properly in months, in gates that opened not from trickery but from exhaustion. The horse never needed to exist. Something else was already doing the killing. Let's talk about the least romantic subject in military history, daily caloric requirements. An adult human needs roughly 2,000 calories per day to maintain basic function. A soldier, someone expected to wear armor, carry weapons, patrol walls, and occasionally fight for their life, needs closer to 3,000. Multiply that by the population of a Bronze Age citadel, then multiply again by 365 days, then multiply once more by 10 years. The number that emerges is the real enemy, not Achilles, not Odysseus. Just math, sitting patiently outside the walls doing what math does best. Troy was a prosperous city before the siege, wealthy from trade and positioned at the crossroads of major shipping routes. The granaries were full. The storerooms were stocked. When the Greek ships first appeared on the horizon, the Trojans probably felt confident. They had supplies. They had walls. They had time. Except time was exactly what they didn't have. Because supplies don't last forever, and a besieged city can't grow more. The first year wouldn't have been terrible. Rationing began early, of course, but people adapted. The wealthy ate slightly less extravagantly. The poor ate slightly less, period. Livestock was slaughtered more strategically, preserved for winter months. The granaries dropped by predictable increments, but they still held grain. By year 3, the livestock was gone. Not the meat itself, that had been consumed immediately after slaughter. The animals themselves. No more breeding. No more milk. No more cheese. The diet simplified brutally. Grain, legumes, whatever could be dried and stored. By year 5, the seed grain started disappearing. This was the true inflection point. The moment when a city stopped planning for a future after the siege and started consuming its own tomorrow. Seed grain is sacred in agricultural societies. Eating it means acknowledging that there will be no next harvest, no recovery, no return to normal. The dogs disappeared around year 6. Then the rats became harder to find. People didn't talk about what else vanished from the streets. The Greeks, meanwhile, sat on the plain below and waited. They didn't need to breach the walls. The walls were doing the work for them, holding an entire population in place while calories slowly converted to corpses. The Trojan horse is a story about Greek cleverness. The siege of Troy was actually a story about Greek patience and the brutal arithmetic of a population eating itself to death. Hunger is slow. Thirst is not. Troy sits on a hill overlooking the Scamander Plain, which sounds strategically brilliant until one considers what hills lack: reliable water. The city survived on an elaborate system of cisterns, underground reservoirs carved from bedrock and lined with plaster, designed to catch and store every drop of rainfall. In peacetime, these cisterns were supplemented by access to the river below by wells, by the constant traffic of water carriers moving between the city and the surrounding springs. In wartime, none of that existed. The Greeks controlled the plain. The Greeks controlled the river access. The Greeks controlled every water source outside those walls. What Troy had was what Troy had stored, and what Troy had stored was finite. There's a particular sound that haunts siege accounts across history: the echo of empty cisterns. Stone chambers designed to hold thousands of gallons of water begin to ring hollow as levels drop. Footsteps echo differently. Voices carry strangely. The entire underground infrastructure of the city becomes a resonating chamber for its own approaching death. Water rationing is worse than food rationing in almost every measurable way. The human body can survive weeks without food, running on fat reserves and muscle tissue and sheer biological stubbornness. Without water, that timeline collapses to days. And unlike hunger, which creeps, thirst screams. It dominates thought, erases reason, drives people to decisions that would otherwise be unthinkable. The Mediterranean summer turned those cisterns into echoing tombs. Stone holds heat. Underground chambers that stayed cool in spring became ovens by August. Whatever water remained grew warm, stale, thick with the taste of plaster and desperation. People drank it anyway. Then came the contamination. Concentrated populations with failing sanitation and dwindling water supplies create perfect conditions for waterborne disease. Dysentery spread through the defenders, weakening them faster than starvation alone. The city's physicians had treatments for wounds, for fevers, for the ordinary ailments of peacetime. They had nothing for an entire population drinking from slowly poisoning wells. The cisterns didn't run dry all at once. That would have been almost merciful, a clear endpoint. Instead, they dropped incrementally, month by month, year by year, the hollow echo growing louder with each passing season. The walls still held. The people inside them were already dying. Geography won the Trojan War. Not Achilles. Not the gods. Not a wooden horse. Just the simple, brutal fact that Troy sat exactly where it shouldn't have. The citadel occupied a commanding position on a ridge overlooking the Scamander Plain, with clear sightlines to the Dardanelles Strait and the sea approaches beyond. For a trading city, this was perfect. Merchants could spot incoming ships hours before arrival. Tax collectors could monitor every vessel passing through the straits. Raiders could be seen long before they reached striking distance. For a besieged city, this position was a death sentence. Those commanding heights that made Troy rich also made Troy visible. Every movement on the walls could be observed from the plain below. Every sortie could be anticipated, prepared for, crushed before it reached the Greek camp. The very geography that made Troy wealthy made Troy trapped. The Greeks understood this immediately. They didn't need to storm the walls. They needed only to occupy the plain, control the river access, and establish naval patrols that cut Troy off from sea resupply. The Scamander Plain became a killing field for any Trojan force desperate enough to venture out. The strait became a blockade that no friendly merchant would risk running. Troy's walls were genuinely impressive, among the most sophisticated fortifications of the Bronze Age. They incorporated lessons from centuries of siege warfare. Thick stone bases to resist battering rams, sloped surfaces to deflect projectiles, multiple gates that created kill zones for any attackers who breached the outer perimeter. The walls worked. That was the terrible irony. They worked so well that the Trojans had no reason to abandon them, no escape route that didn't lead through Greek spears. The Greeks settled in for what they knew would be a long campaign. They built semi-permanent camps, established supply routes, created the infrastructure of occupation. The plain of Scamander transformed from farmland to forward operating base, complete with ships beached for maintenance, forges producing replacement weapons, and the steady arrival of supply convoys from allied cities. From the walls above, the Trojans watched this infrastructure grow. They watched the Greek camps become villages, the villages become permanent, the permanent become inevitable. They watched their own salvation sail past on merchant vessels that would never stop, would never risk the blockade, would never remember that Troy existed except as a cautionary tale. The walls held. The plain was lost. And the plain was everything. Here is the unglamorous secret of Greek victory: boats full of grain. While Troy starved behind its magnificent walls, the Greeks maintained supply lines stretching back across the Aegean to friendly ports and allied cities. Ships arrived regularly carrying dried fish, preserved meat, olive oil, and most crucially, grain. The besieging army never wanted for calories because the besieging army never stopped receiving them. This was not heroic. It was not poetic. It was logistics, the least celebrated and most decisive factor in every military campaign since humans first learned to organize violence. The poems don't mention the quartermaster generals. The myths skip over the shipping manifests. But somewhere in the Greek camp, someone was keeping very careful records of how many tons of wheat arrived each month, and that person won the war. The local terrain contributed too. The Scamander Plain had once supported Trojan agriculture, orchards and fields that fed the city above. Now it fed the Greeks. Foraging parties stripped every edible plant within marching distance. Hunting parties depleted the game. Fishing boats worked the coastal waters. The Greeks transformed Troy's hinterland into their own pantry while the city watched from above, unable to contest the harvest of what had once been their own food. Allied cities sent tribute, both out of genuine support and sensible self-interest. A coalition victory at Troy meant trade routes secured, rivals eliminated, and grateful warlords who would remember their friends. The supply convoys represented investments in a future where the siege succeeded. The merchants expected returns on those investments. They would wait as long as necessary. The Greek camp became a small city of its own, complete with markets, craftsmen, and all the support infrastructure that keeps an army functional. Bronze needed working, leather needed curing, weapons needed sharpening, and wounds needed treating. None of this happened without steady supply lines, and the supply lines never failed. Troy had no such network. Cut off by sea, surrounded by land, the city consumed its stored supplies and then began consuming itself. Every calorie that entered the Greek camp was a calorie Troy couldn't match. Every month that passed tilted the balance further. The wooden horse gets the credit. The supply ships did the work. 10 years is a long time to hate someone. It's also a long time to refuse talking to them. The myths present the Trojan War as uninterrupted combat, heroic duels from dawn to dusk, an endless cycle of valor and vengeance. The reality was almost certainly more complicated. Sieges involve waiting. Waiting involves boredom. Boredom involves conversation. And conversation, eventually, involves negotiation. Messengers would have passed between the camps. They always do. Heralds carrying terms, demands, counter-offers, ultimatums that both sides knew would be rejected, but that served to establish positions, to buy time, to remind the enemy that alternatives to total destruction still existed. The Greeks wanted Helen returned, or claimed they did. The Trojans wanted the Greeks to leave. Neither side got what they wanted, but they kept talking anyway. Inside Troy, those negotiations would have created factions. There were always factions. Those who wanted to return Helen and end the suffering. Those who refused surrender on principle, seeing it as dishonor worse than death. Those who believed the gods would intervene. Those who had stopped believing in anything except the empty ache in their stomachs. Starvation accelerates political fracture. When resources become scarce, distribution becomes political. Who gets the last of the grain? The soldiers who defend the walls, or the children who represent the city's future? The nobles who claim ancestral rights, or the craftsmen whose skills maintain the city's infrastructure? Every meal becomes a statement about values, and values diverge under pressure. By year 8, by year 9, by the grinding misery of year 10, those factions would have grown desperate. Someone inside Troy wanted the siege to end. Someone had family in the Greek camp, or owed debts that couldn't be repaid, or simply couldn't watch any more children die slowly. Someone made a decision. The gates of Troy didn't open because Trojans were fooled by a wooden horse. The gates opened because someone inside chose to end the suffering. Betrayal is an ugly word, but so is starvation, and by the 10th year, the choice between them had become very simple. This is the part of the story that the myths skip over. The human factor. The moment when endurance became impossible, and someone decided that living under Greek rule was better than dying behind Trojan walls. That person's name is lost to history, replaced by a more comfortable fiction about clever carpentry. It's easier to blame a wooden horse than to acknowledge that human beings, pushed far enough, will open any gate. By the final year, Troy had become very quiet, not peaceful. Quiet is different from peaceful. The marketplaces that once rang with commerce stood empty, stalls abandoned, goods long since traded or hoarded or consumed. The forges had cooled because there was no fuel to spare and no strength to work the bellows. The children didn't play in the streets anymore. The children didn't have the energy to play. Starvation has a particular appearance that accounts across history describe with uncomfortable consistency. The skin stretches thin over prominent bones, taking on a papery texture that tears easily and heals slowly. The eyes sink into hollows. The hair loses its luster, becomes brittle, falls out in clumps. Joints swell while limbs wither. The body consumes itself in a specific order. First the fat reserves, then the muscle tissue, then the organs themselves begin to fail. The soldiers on the wall still wore armor, still carried weapons, still maintained the appearance of defense. But armor fit differently on bodies that had lost 30, 40, 50 pounds. Swords that once swung easily now required both hands. The simple act of climbing to a guard post became an athletic challenge. These were not defenders anymore. They were scarecrows, maintaining the shape of resistance while the substance slowly dissolved. The Greeks could see it from the plain below. The movements on the walls grew slower, less frequent, less coordinated. The sorties that had once challenged their perimeter stopped entirely. The Trojans weren't hiding or strategizing. They simply lacked the caloric reserves to do anything except stand, watch, and wait for the end. The sound of the city changed too. Healthy cities hum with constant background noise. Conversations, commerce, construction, the thousand small sounds of people living their lives. Starving cities grow silent incrementally, each voice that stops speaking leaving a small void in the soundscape. By year 10, Troy's silence had become oppressive, broken only by the hollow echo of footsteps on empty streets and the occasional distant wail of grief. The Greeks didn't need a clever trick anymore. They needed only to approach the walls and see if anyone had the strength to resist. The answer, by then, was obvious to everyone except the poets who would later reinvent the ending. The walls still stood. They would stand for millennia, layer upon layer of rebuilding testament to their engineering excellence. But the people who had relied on those walls were already gone in every way that mattered. The Greeks weren't storming a fortress. They were walking into a tomb that hadn't yet admitted it was one. So what was the wooden horse, if it wasn't a hollow statue full of Greek commandos? Scholars have debated this for centuries, and the theories range from plausible to creative. The most straightforward explanation, it was a battering ram. Ancient siege equipment often received animal names based on their appearance or function. A ram's head decorated the front of many battering rams, giving them their name. A horse-shaped siege tower or ram would have been well within Bronze Age naming conventions. The horse that broke Troy's gates might simply have been the large wooden machine that finally smashed through them once the defenders were too weak to resist. Another theory points to earthquakes. The region around Troy is seismically active, and Poseidon, god of both the sea and earthquakes, was also associated with horses. A catastrophic earthquake that damaged Troy's walls might have been remembered as Poseidon's horse, a divine intervention later transformed into Odysseus's clever construction. This would explain why the gods feature so prominently in the fall of Troy, because the Greeks genuinely believed divine forces had finally intervened on their behalf. But the most important insight isn't about what the horse was. It's about why the horse story persists. Humans love narratives of cleverness defeating strength. The underdog who outthinks the giant. The trickster who wins through wit rather than brute force. These stories reassure us that intelligence matters, that the powerful can be overcome, that wars are won by heroes rather than logistics officers. The Trojan horse is satisfying in exactly the way that starvation arithmetic is not. Every famous military victory in history hides a similar transformation. Alexander's conquests were built on supply trains and road building more than tactical genius. Napoleon's defeats came from broken logistics as much as enemy bullets. The greatest generals in history were, without exception, obsessive about food, water, ammunition, and transport. But that doesn't make for compelling poetry. No one writes epics about the quartermaster who calculated grain requirements correctly. So we get wooden horses instead. We get cunning stratagems and heroic deceptions and clever tricks that somehow win wars overnight. The boring truth that Troy fell because 10 years of blockade destroyed its ability to resist gets buried under a more attractive fiction. The next time someone describes a military victory as brilliant strategy, look for the granary ledger. Look for the supply lines and the logistics networks and the slow, patient arithmetic of resources versus requirements. The horse is almost always a story we tell ourselves to make war seem more meaningful than it actually is. Troy's walls still stand, partially excavated, a testament to Bronze Age engineering excellence. The horse, naturally, is nowhere to be found, because it was never there. What was there, what is always there at the end of every siege, is much simpler and much harder to memorialize. Empty storerooms, dry cisterns, and the quiet that comes when a city has finally stopped fighting. Not because it was tricked, because it was starved. The poems remember the horse. The stones remember the hunger. And somehow, 3,000 years later, we still prefer the poems. Picture it. Flames licking up marble columns, sparks dancing through the night sky, centuries of human knowledge turning to ash while scholars weep in the streets. It's a magnificent image. It's also almost entirely wrong. The Library of Alexandria did not die in a single dramatic conflagration. There was no moment when the sum of human wisdom went up in smoke while some villain cackled in the foreground. The real story is quieter, slower, and infinitely more familiar. The library didn't burn. It starved. Yes, there were fires. Several of them, actually, spread across centuries. Julius Caesar accidentally torched some warehouses near the harbor in 48 BCE, and some scrolls probably went with them. Aurelian's forces damaged part of the city in the 3rd century. The Serapeum, which housed a daughter collection, was demolished in 391 CE. But none of these events destroyed the library. By the time any flames came, there wasn't much left to burn. The truth is less cinematic but more instructive. The greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world died the way most institutions die, through budget cuts, deferred maintenance, and the slow realization that nobody with money cared enough to keep it running. The scrolls didn't vanish in a single night. They crumbled over decades in humid storage rooms while administrators argued about funding. They rotted while scholars left for better-paying positions elsewhere. They were gnawed by mice in collections that nobody had inventoried in years. The question that matters isn't who burned the library. It's why anyone stopped caring about it in the first place. This is a story about what happens when a society decides, quietly and incrementally, that knowledge isn't worth the expense. It's about the gap between what we claim to value and what we actually fund. And it's about the uncomfortable reality that civilization's greatest losses rarely come from dramatic attacks. They come from 1,000 small decisions to spend money on something else. Before examining how the library died, it helps to understand what it actually was. Not a building. Not really. The Library of Alexandria was an institution, a government program, a research university with a budget line and a bureaucracy and all the mundane infrastructure that phrase implies. The heart of the operation was the Mosion, which translates roughly as Shrine of the Muses, but functioned more like a state-funded think tank. Scholars at the Mosion received salaries. They ate in communal dining halls. They lived in lodgings provided by the crown. They paid no taxes. In exchange, they did research, they taught, and they organized the largest collection of written knowledge the ancient world had ever assembled. This arrangement cost money. Significant money. The kind of money that requires annual appropriations and royal attention and the ongoing conviction that scholarship serves the state. The collection itself numbered somewhere between 40,000 and 400,000 scrolls, depending on which ancient source one believes and how one counts. The precision doesn't matter. What matters is scale. Tens of thousands of papyrus documents, each one requiring storage space, cataloging, and eventual replacement. Because papyrus doesn't last. Not in Alexandria's climate. The city sits on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt, where the air carries moisture from the sea and the Nile Delta nearby adds its own humid contribution. Papyrus, made from processed reeds, absorbs that moisture. It swells. It grows soft. It develops mold in the dark corners of storage rooms. A papyrus scroll stored carefully in Alexandria's climate might last a century. Stored carelessly, decades. Stored in a leaking building during a budget crisis, considerably less. Which means the library was never a static collection. It was a living organism that required constant feeding. Every scroll that degraded beyond legibility had to be copied onto fresh papyrus by trained scribes. Every copying required materials, labor, and supervision. Standing still meant shrinking. Walk through the storage rooms in the library's prime, and the smell would have been distinctive. Papyrus carries a faint, sweet, grassy odor when fresh. Old papyrus smells dustier, with undertones of whatever has begun to grow on it. The rooms would have been dim, cool when possible, organized by subject and origin. Shelves upon shelves of cylindrical cases, each containing scrolls wound around wooden rods, each labeled with a small tag identifying author and contents. And somewhere in those rooms, always the soft scritching of insects and the fainter sounds of mice. The enemies were never far. The library was magnificent. It was also expensive. And when the money started drying up, the mathematics became brutally simple. The Ptolemies understood propaganda. When they took control of Egypt after Alexander's death, they were Macedonian outsiders ruling an ancient civilization. They needed legitimacy. They needed to prove they belonged among the great powers of the Mediterranean world. And one of their tools for doing so was the aggressive acquisition of knowledge. The library wasn't built for the love of learning, though learning happened there. It was built because owning the world's largest collection of scrolls made the Ptolemies look powerful, sophisticated, and culturally dominant. Every ship that entered Alexandria's harbor could be searched for books. Scrolls were confiscated, copied, and sometimes the copies were returned while the originals went into the royal collection. Acquisition agents traveled the Mediterranean buying texts, sometimes at prices that scandalized accountants. This required a budget, a substantial one. Copyists needed salaries. Papyrus needed purchasing. Buildings needed maintenance. Scholars needed stipends generous enough to attract them from rival cities. The acquisition agents needed travel expenses and purchasing funds. The staff who organized, cataloged, and retrieved scrolls needed compensation. The cooks in the dining hall needed ingredients. The whole operation ran on royal gold. And the gold flowed for a while. During the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, the Ptolemies were wealthy, ambitious, and invested in their library as a prestige project. New scrolls arrived. New scholars took up residence. The collection grew. Then the dynasty began to rot. The later Ptolemies were not, as a general rule, competent rulers. Civil wars between rival claimants drained the treasury. Territorial losses reduced revenue. The infrastructure of the kingdom began to crumble as maintenance was deferred in favor of immediate political survival. And when money gets tight, cultural spending is always an easy target. The first signs would have been subtle. Fewer new acquisitions each year. Vacant positions going unfilled. Repair requests delayed. The dining hall serving simpler meals. The stipends not quite keeping pace with the cost of living. Nobody announced that the library was being defunded. No pharaoh declared that knowledge was no longer important. The budget just got a little smaller each year. The staff learned to make do with less. And the scrolls in the back storage rooms, the ones nobody had requested in decades, quietly continued their slow decomposition. By the time Cleopatra lost to Rome and the Ptolemaic dynasty ended entirely, the library had already been declining for generations. The Romans inherited an institution that still functioned but had long since passed its peak. The Golden Age was over. The long twilight had begun. Alexandria's climate was beautiful for humans and catastrophic for papyrus. The city enjoyed mild winters and warm summers, cooled by Mediterranean breezes. Pleasant for walking, for working, for the outdoor life that made Greek culture thrive. But those same breezes carried moisture. The sea exhaled humidity constantly, and the Nile Delta to the east added its own wet breath. The air in Alexandria was never truly dry. Papyrus is made from reeds. Processed reeds, pounded flat and pressed together, but organic material nonetheless. It absorbs moisture like a sponge absorbs water. In a humid environment, papyrus fibers swell. The writing surface buckles and warps. Inks run or fade. Mold finds footholds in the microscopic spaces between fibers. The storage rooms of the library would have smelled of this slow destruction. A musty sweetness under everything, the scent of vegetable matter beginning its long return to earth. On humid days, the smell would intensify. Staff probably grew so accustomed to it they no longer noticed. The mice certainly didn't mind the smell. Rodents love libraries. The papyrus itself offers nesting material. The wooden scroll rods provide gnawing opportunities. The paste used in binding and the organic sizing on writing surfaces offer actual nutrition. A library in a warm climate is essentially a mouse paradise with delusions of grandeur. Insects joined the feast. Bookworms, which aren't actually worms but beetle larvae, tunneled through scrolls with the patient determination of creatures that have millions of years of evolution optimizing them for exactly this task. Silverfish nibbled at the edges. Moths laid eggs in the darker corners. Fighting this biological assault required constant vigilance. Inspections. Cleaning. Removal of damaged materials before infestation could spread. Replacement of storage containers. Treatment of wood against insects. All of which required staff, time, and money. When budgets tightened, pest control became optional. Inspections happened less frequently. Damaged scrolls piled up in corners waiting for attention that never came. The mice grew bolder in the silence. Imagine a shelf in a distant storage room. 3rd century CE. The building's roof developed a small leak 2 years ago, reported to maintenance, never repaired. Water stains marked the ceiling. The scrolls on the top shelf show moisture damage, their edges furry with mold. Below them, a colony of mice has made its home. Generations of rodents peacefully shredding the works of philosophers and poets to line their nests. No one has entered this room in months, perhaps years. The catalog that should track these scrolls was last updated during a different administration. The junior librarian responsible for this section doesn't read the dialect some of these texts are written in. He marks them as present in his reports without checking. Nobody checks his reports. The scrolls continue their quiet disintegration. By the time anyone notices, there will be nothing left to save. Scholars are not, as a rule, ascetics purely for the love of knowledge. They have rent to pay. They have families to feed. They have professional ambitions and personal comfort to consider. When a rival institution offers more money, more resources, and more political stability, scholars tend to follow the opportunity. Pergamon understood this perfectly. The kingdom of Pergamon, in what is now Western Turkey, built its own library in deliberate competition with Alexandria. The Attalid dynasty that ruled there wanted the same prestige benefits the Ptolemies enjoyed. If they couldn't be the only great library, they could at least be the better one. Pergamon offered competitive salaries, better working conditions, superior funding for research projects, political stability that Alexandria, with its endless Ptolemaic intrigues, couldn't match. One by one, then in larger numbers, Alexandria's best scholars began to leave. The library felt this loss in ways that weren't immediately visible. A senior scholar leaving took decades of institutional knowledge with them. They knew which scrolls were misattributed in the catalog. They knew which storage rooms had water damage. They knew the scribal shorthand used in older copies. They knew where the good texts actually were, regardless of what the records claimed. Junior staff left behind didn't know these things. They relied on documentation that was incomplete at best, actively wrong at worst. They copied texts they couldn't fully understand, introducing errors. They filed scrolls in the wrong sections. They declared texts lost that were merely misfiled. Rome accelerated the drain. After the Roman conquest of the Mediterranean, wealthy Romans became the most generous patrons of scholarship. Roman libraries paid premium salaries. Roman aristocrats commissioned works and rewarded their authors lavishly. A talented scholar in Alexandria could live comfortably. The same scholar in Rome could live luxuriously. The reading rooms in Alexandria grew quieter. Fewer visiting scholars requesting texts. Fewer debates echoing through the colonnades. The dining hall served fewer meals each year. The intellectual energy that once made the institution famous dissipated like morning fog. The library still existed. It still held scrolls. But the living scholarly community that gave those scrolls meaning was hollowing out. Texts without readers are just storage problems. Catalogs without experts to interpret them become fiction. A library is not a building or a collection. It's a community of people who understand what they're preserving. That community was leaving. And it wasn't coming back. The library had always been a political project. The Ptolemies built it to impress. They maintained it to demonstrate their cultural sophistication. They funded it because having the world's largest collection of scrolls made other rulers feel slightly inferior. Prestige justified the expense. When that calculus changed, so did the budget. Roman governors of Egypt didn't need the library for legitimacy. Rome had its own libraries now, its own cultural institutions, its own claims to civilized grandeur. Alexandria's collection was interesting but not politically essential. A governor might visit, might make appropriate sounds of appreciation, but he wasn't fighting for the library's budget when resources were tight. He had legions to pay, aqueducts to build, his own career to advance. The library continued because institutions have momentum. It had staff who came to work each day. It had buildings that still stood. It had traditions and procedures and a bureaucratic existence that sustained itself through sheer inertia. But the political champions who might have demanded increased funding, who might have treated cuts as personal insults, were gone. Then came Christianity. The library wasn't burned by Christians. That's another myth that needs dispelling. But the Christianization of the Roman Empire did fundamentally shift where elite patronage flowed. Churches needed building. Monasteries needed endowing. Bishops needed impressive accommodations. Christian education needed funding. These new institutions competed directly with the library for the same pool of wealthy donors and governmental appropriations. A rich Alexandrian family deciding where to direct their generosity now had options that aligned with their faith. The prestige of funding pagan scholarship couldn't compete with the spiritual rewards of funding Christian churches. No one banned the library. No emperor decreed that Alexandria's scrolls should be destroyed. The violence that sometimes accompanied religious transition was real, but not primarily directed at books. What happened was subtler and more devastating. The library simply stopped mattering to the people who controlled resources. Scholarship in late antiquity increasingly moved to Christian monasteries, where monks copied the texts they found valuable and let others decay. The filter of Christian scribes determined what survived. Works that offended Christian sensibilities, or simply didn't interest monastic copiers, quietly vanished. The library had been built on prestige. It survived on prestige. When prestige shifted to new institutions, the library had nothing left to offer its would-be patrons. The buildings still stood. The scrolls still rotted in their cases. But the reason for the library's existence had evaporated like water from the Nile under summer sun. The decline took centuries. That's the part that's hardest to grasp. No single generation watched the library collapse. No individual librarian witnessed both the glory days and the final inventory of moldering scrolls. The decay was generational, each cohort inheriting a slightly diminished institution and accepting that diminishment as normal. Under Augustus, the library still functioned. Reduced from its Ptolemaic peak, certainly, but operational. Scholars still worked there. Copies were still made. The collection still grew, if slowly. A visitor from Rome might have found it impressive enough. By the 3rd century, the empire was in crisis. Civil wars erupted with exhausting regularity. Economic collapse degraded the currency. Plagues swept through cities. Alexandria suffered along with everywhere else. The library's budget, never generous in this era, shrank further. Positions went unfilled. Buildings went unrepaired. The acquisition of new texts effectively ceased. The Serapeum became increasingly important during this period. This temple to Serapis, located in a different part of Alexandria, housed a daughter collection. Smaller than the main library, but more defensible, more compact, easier to maintain with reduced resources. As the main Motion declined, the Serapeum absorbed what remained of scholarly activity. The 4th century brought new pressures. Christian-pagan tensions flared violently at times. In 391, a Christian mob destroyed the Serapeum itself, demolishing the temple in an act of religious triumphalism. Whether significant scrolls still remained, there is debated. The building certainly contained some books. Whether those books were treasures or leftovers depends on which scholar one asks. By the 5th century, the institutional library had effectively ceased to exist. Some scrolls remained scattered across Alexandria in private collections, in church libraries, in the hands of individual scholars. But the coordinated collection, the cataloged repository, the functioning research institution, all that was gone. The final inventory, had anyone bothered to conduct one, would have revealed the true tragedy. Not empty shelves, but shelves full of damaged goods. Scrolls too deteriorated to read. Texts missing their endings, their beginnings, their middles. Catalogs that no longer matched physical reality. Copies so corrupted by generations of errors that they contradicted their sources. The library didn't disappear in a night. It evaporated over generations, leaving behind the institutional equivalent of a dried riverbed. The shape remained visible. The substance had long since flowed away. The losses are real and they are staggering. Aeschylus wrote roughly 90 plays. 7 survive. Sophocles wrote over 120. 7 survive. Euripides wrote around 90. 18 survive, and some of those only because they happened to be alphabetically adjacent to his more popular works and got copied together. This pattern repeats across every field. We have fragments of Sappho that suggest complete masterpieces we will never read. We have references to scientific treatises by Aristarchus on heliocentrism centuries before Copernicus that exist only as mentions in other authors' work. We have titles of historical accounts that would revolutionize our understanding of antiquity if they had survived. The library held works we've lost entirely. Not damaged, not fragmented, simply gone. Texts that deteriorated in storage while no one was paying attention. Texts that were never copied onto fresh papyrus because the copying budget ran out. Texts that mice ate, that mold consumed, that humidity reduced to illegible pulp. But here's the complicating factor. By its final centuries, the library itself no longer knew what it contained. Catalogs require maintenance. Every time a scroll is moved, relabeled, damaged, copied, or lost, the catalog must be updated. Every time a cataloger makes an error, that error propagates. Every time an underpaid junior librarian marks a scroll as present without actually checking, the records drift further from reality. Scholars in late antiquity complained that they couldn't find texts they knew the library once held. They requested works and received apologies or wrong items or nothing at all. The institution had lost track of its own contents. Scrolls that technically still existed had become effectively lost because nobody could locate them in the physical chaos of deteriorating storage rooms. Some works survived because they were copied elsewhere. Monasteries preserved what interested monastic copiers. Private collectors in Constantinople saved their favorites. Arab scholars translated Greek texts that would otherwise have vanished. The survival of ancient knowledge depended on a web of copying and transmission far wider than any single institution. But the works that existed only in Alexandria, that had never been copied, that sat in storage waiting for someone to request them, those works are gone. Not burned. Not dramatically destroyed. Simply never copied, never maintained, never given the attention that preservation requires. The tragedy isn't that someone destroyed the library. The tragedy is that the library destroyed itself, slowly, through the accumulated weight of deferred maintenance and declining investment. The scrolls that vanished didn't need an enemy. They just needed everyone to be too busy, too broke, or too indifferent to save them. Let's talk about public libraries closing across the English-speaking world. Reduced hours. Staff layoffs. Branches consolidated. buildings sold. The language is always careful, emphasizing efficiency and modernization and the changing needs of communities. The reality is simpler. Someone decided that maintaining these institutions wasn't worth the cost. Let's talk about universities. Full-time faculty replaced by adjuncts paid by the course with no benefits and no job security. Library acquisition budgets frozen while digital subscription costs explode. Maintenance deferred until roofs leak and HVAC systems fail. Graduate programs shrinking as funding evaporates. Let's talk about archives. The boxes of historical documents sitting in basements with climate control that stopped working years ago. The digitization projects canceled midstream. The archivists laid off, taking their institutional knowledge with them, leaving collections that technically exist, but that nobody left behind knows how to access or interpret. Let's talk about museums storing collections they can no longer afford to conserve. About newspapers eliminating their archive departments. About research institutions watching their senior scholars retire without hiring replacements. The Library of Alexandria didn't need an enemy. Neither do our own institutions of knowledge preservation. All they need is for funding to tighten a little each year. All they need is for deferred maintenance to accumulate. All they need is for expertise to migrate to better paying opportunities while positions go unfilled. All they need is for the slow rot of neglect to continue undisturbed. No one announces that knowledge is no longer worth preserving. No villain declares war on scholarship. The process is quieter than that. Budget meetings. Hiring freezes. Strategic realignments. Doing more with less. Prioritizing core functions, which somehow never includes the archives or the preservation program or the specialist who knows what's actually in the back rooms. The scrolls we're not copying right now, in whatever metaphorical sense applies to our own era, will be lost just as thoroughly as those mice-gnawed papyri in Alexandria's storage rooms. Digital files corrupt. Servers fail. Formats become obsolete. Without active maintenance, without ongoing investment, without someone actually doing the work of preservation, information vanishes. This is the real lesson of Alexandria. Not that some ancient catastrophe destroyed human knowledge, but that human knowledge requires constant, expensive, unglamorous effort to maintain. It's not enough to acquire. It's not enough to store. Preservation is a verb, not a noun. It requires people and money and attention, year after year, generation after generation. The moment we decide that knowledge isn't worth that investment, the long decay begins. And by the time anyone notices, there's nothing left to save but damaged goods and empty catalogs and the faint smell of what used to matter, rotting quietly in rooms that nobody enters anymore. Sleep well. The Sui dynasty was dying the way empires usually die, loudly, messily, and with a profound indifference to the children caught in the middle. In Luoyang, around the year 600, a boy named Chen Yi watched his world come apart at the seams. His father was a Confucian scholar, which meant the family had books, education, and absolutely no practical skills for surviving a civil war. Warlords carved the countryside into bleeding pieces. Famine crept through the cities like a patient guest who refused to leave. The grand canals that were supposed to unite the empire had bankrupted it instead, and now the tax collectors fought the rebel armies for the right to take what little remained. Chen Yi's father died when the boy was 10. The details are lost to history, which probably means they were ordinary, which probably means they were terrible. Disease, starvation, violence. Pick your favorite apocalypse. The early 7th century had them all on special. His older brother, facing the same collapsing world with slightly more years and slightly fewer options, did what many young men did when everything else failed. He became a Buddhist monk. The monasteries offered food, shelter, and something even rarer in those years, a reason to believe tomorrow might be worth reaching. Chen Yi followed his brother into the temple at 13. Not out of spiritual calling, necessarily. Out of survival. But something happened inside those walls. The boy who entered looking for meals discovered he had a mind that wouldn't stop asking questions. The sutras fascinated him, not just as sacred texts, but as puzzles. He noticed that different scriptures said different things about enlightenment. Some described it as gradual cultivation over lifetimes. Others promised sudden awakening in a single moment. Some texts contradicted other texts. Some contradicted themselves. Most monks accepted these differences as mystery, as different paths up the same mountain. Chen Yi couldn't. The inconsistencies gnawed at him the way hunger once had. Somewhere, he reasoned there had to be original sources. Somewhere, the truth existed before the translations blurred it. The question would consume his life. It would nearly end it too. By 20, the young monk now known as Xuanzang had become impossible to ignore. His ordination came with honors that usually took decades to earn. His lectures drew crowds that spilled out of temple halls into courtyards. He could recite entire sutras from memory, debate intricate points of doctrine, and do both with a clarity that made other scholars feel slightly embarrassed about their own understanding. The Buddhist establishment of Tang Dynasty China had found its rising star. And Xuanzang repaid their admiration by traveling everywhere to study with everyone, only to conclude that everyone was working from broken sources. He walked from monastery to monastery across China, seeking out every master with a reputation for wisdom. Each one taught him something valuable. Each one also taught him something that contradicted what the last master had said. The more he learned, the more certain he became that Chinese Buddhism was built on foundations of sand, scriptures translated by well-meaning scholars who didn't fully understand the original languages, copied by scribes who made errors, interpreted by teachers who filled gaps with guesswork. The texts disagreed because the texts were incomplete. Then he heard about Nalanda. The rumors filtered along the Silk Road trade routes like precious cargo. In India, they said there existed a university unlike anything in China. 10,000 monks. Millions of manuscripts. The original scriptures in their original languages, untouched by translation errors. The source code of Buddhism, if you wanted to be anachronistic about it. Xuanzang wanted to be very anachronistic about it. He wanted to go there. In 627, he submitted a formal petition to Emperor Taizong requesting permission to travel west. The emperor, busy consolidating his new dynasty after yet another round of civil wars, had simpler concerns. The Silk Road was dangerous. The Western Turks were unpredictable. Chinese travelers kept getting killed or captured. So Taizong did what emperors do when they want problems to go away. He banned travel entirely. Xuanzang's petition was denied. The western borders were closed. Going anyway would be a capital crime. The monk spent 2 years reconsidering. Then he stopped reconsidering. In the autumn of 629, Xuanzang slipped out of Chang'an under cover of darkness and became a wanted man. The decision had the flavor of quiet madness. He was 30 years old, had never traveled outside China, spoke no foreign languages, and possessed exactly the survival skills one would expect from someone who'd spent 17 years reading scripture. The route ahead crossed deserts that swallowed caravans whole, mountain ranges that killed experienced traders, and kingdoms that changed rulers the way other places changed seasons. The Tang government had explicitly forbidden the journey on pain of death, which meant that even if he survived the geography, his own countrymen were legally obligated to execute him. He went anyway. Some obsessions don't respond well to practical objections. The first leg was almost the last. Xuanzang traveled northwest, moving between oasis towns and trying to avoid imperial checkpoints. He failed. At the frontier garrison near Yumen Pass, the border guards received word of a rogue monk heading west and moved to intercept him. Here the story acquires its first miracle, though like most miracles, it came with a human face. The local Buddhist commander, a man whose name has been lost but whose compassion hasn't, found himself holding the arrest warrant for a scholar whose reputation had preceded him. He could have followed orders. He could have sent Xuanzang back to Chang'an in chains, collected whatever reward awaited, and slept soundly. Instead, he tore up the warrant and told the monk to run. Xuanzang ran. Past the last watchtower. Past the final frontier. Into the forbidden zone where the Tang writ didn't reach and the Taklamakan desert waited with the patience of a predator that had never once gone hungry. He had one elderly horse, purchased from a local who probably knew it wouldn't survive the journey. He had water for 5 days. He had a guide who abandoned him after 3, presumably having calculated that accompanying a man this determined to die was bad for personal longevity. The desert crossing ahead would take 7 days minimum. The math, as they say, didn't math. The Taklamakan Desert has a name that translates, depending on who you ask, as either place of no return or go in and you won't come out. The locals weren't trying to be dramatic. They were trying to be accurate. Xuanzang entered alone, and for the first few days, the desert was content to simply be unpleasant. Sand in his mouth, his nose, his ears, the folds of his robes. Heat that pressed down like a physical weight during the day. Cold that cut through everything at night. His elderly horse plodded forward with the resigned determination of a creature that had stopped hoping for better and settled for forward momentum. Then he made a mistake. While reaching for his water bag, he fumbled. The bag fell. The water poured out onto sand that drank it faster than seemed physically possible. One moment he had supplies for 2 more days. The next moment he had a wet patch on the ground that was already evaporating. 4 days without water in the Taklamakan. The math still didn't math, but now it was actively hostile. Xuanzang kept walking. What else was there to do? Somewhere around day 3 of dehydration, the hallucinations started. He later described demon armies surrounding him, phantom fires in the distance, shapes that shifted and beckoned and promised relief in directions that led nowhere. His lips cracked. His vision blurred. He recited sutras to keep his mind anchored. though the words came out as little more than rasps. The horse saved him. On what should have been his final night, the animal suddenly veered off course. Xuanzang was too weak to correct it, too far gone to care. He let the reins go slack and waited for the end. Instead, the horse walked directly to a small oasis, invisible until they were nearly upon it. Grass. Water. Survival. Xuanzang spent a day recovering, then continued west. He emerged from the Taklamakan into the kingdom of Turfan, where the Buddhist king Xuanzang had heard rumors of a brilliant Chinese monk and responded to his arrival by weeping with joy and immediately trying to prevent him from ever leaving. The king offered gold, temples, a permanent position as royal chaplain. Xuanzang declined. The king offered more gold. Xuanzang declined again. The king, displaying the negotiating style common to 7th century monarchs, informed Xuanzang that he was forbidden to continue west and would remain in Turfan as an honored guest, whether he wanted to or not. Xuanzang went on hunger strike. For 3 days, he refused all food and water, meditating silently while the king's servants begged him to eat something. Anything, please. Xuanzang finally broke. He gave Xuanzang his blessing, letters of introduction to every ruler on the Silk Road, gold for expenses, and an escort of soldiers and servants to see him safely through the next kingdoms. A pattern was establishing itself. Xuanzang's reputation moved faster than his horse. Doors that should have been locked swung open. The criminal fleeing Chinese justice was becoming, against all probability, a VIP. If the Taklamakan was trying to kill Xuanzang through thirst and madness, the Pamir Mountains decided to try a more direct approach. The route west required crossing what travelers called the Roof of the World, a range of peaks so high that modern mountaineers still approach them with respect and considerable life insurance. Xuanzang's caravan, now swelled with the soldiers and servants from Turfan, began the ascent in weather that couldn't decide if it wanted to freeze them slowly or bury them quickly. Avalanche was a daily possibility. Altitude sickness turned strong men into wheezing invalids. The paths, such as they were, clung to cliff faces with the confidence of suggestions rather than actual infrastructure. Half the party died in the crossing. Not half suffered, not half turned back. Half died. The bodies stayed where they fell because carrying them was impossible and burying them was a luxury no one could afford. Xuanzang kept walking. He recited sutras over the dead and kept walking. The texts in India wouldn't translate themselves. The survivors emerged into a different world. The kingdoms of Central Asia sprawled across the trade routes like a string of pearls, each one distinct, each one eager to host the famous monk whose reputation had somehow outpaced his caravan. In Samarkand, he debated with Zoroastrian priests about the nature of divine fire. In Bactria, he examined Buddhist monasteries built in styles he'd never seen, mixing Indian, Persian, and Greek influences into something entirely new. In the Hindu Kush, he met Turkish Khans who offered horses and safe passage in exchange for blessings. And at Bamiyan, he saw the giant Buddhas. 2 colossal figures carved into a cliff face, the larger one standing over 170 feet tall. Xuanzang recorded them in his travel notes with something approaching awe, describing the gold leaf that covered their robes and the gems that studded their eyes. They had stood for 2 centuries by the time he arrived. they would stand for 14 more until the Taliban dynamited them in 2001. But that was someone else's tragedy in someone else's century. For now, the Buddhas watched as Xuanzang's caravan passed beneath them, heading south toward the Indian subcontinent. Each kingdom had added to his entourage, his letters of introduction, his legitimacy. The criminal monk who'd snuck out of China was entering India as something closer to an official envoy, endorsed by half a continent's worth of rulers. The guards at the border didn't check his papers. They bowed. Xuanzang arrived at Nalanda in 631, and for possibly the first time in his adult life, his questions had answers. The university sprawled across a valley in northeastern India like something that had forgotten to stop growing. 10,000 monks studied within its walls. 2,000 teachers lectured in its halls. The library, and here the numbers become slightly legendary, but not necessarily false, contains somewhere around 9 million manuscripts. 9 million. The entire Buddhist canon in its original Sanskrit, plus commentaries, plus philosophy, plus mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and everything else that 7th century scholars considered worth knowing. Xuanzang walked through the gates and wept. He would later write about the moment with characteristic restraint, but even his measured prose couldn't quite hide the emotion. This was what he'd crossed deserts and mountains and nearly died repeatedly to find. The source. The origin. The unbroken transmission of everything his faith had promised. The abbot of Nalanda was a man named Shilabhadra, 106 years old and very much still teaching. When Xuanzang was brought before him, the ancient monk looked at the Chinese visitor and said something that changed the nature of their encounter entirely. He'd been waiting. Years earlier, Shilabhadra had dreamed of a monk from China who would come to study the highest teachings and carry them back to the East. He'd considered retiring, but the dream had told him to wait. Now, here was the monk, exactly as foretold, standing in his hall with desert sand still in his robes. This was either a miracle or a very convenient piece of institutional mythology. Either way, it meant Xuanzang received access to everything. For 5 years, he stayed at Nalanda. He learned Sanskrit so thoroughly that Indian scholars would later praise his command of their language. He read texts that resolved the contradictions that had plagued him since childhood. Different schools, different emphasis, but one underlying framework that made sense of the variations. He attended lectures, participated in debates, and slowly assembled the collection of scriptures he would carry home. But Nalanda taught him something else too, something less comfortable. Indian Buddhism, for all its magnificence, was fracturing. Theological disputes had hardened into factional wars. Different schools excommunicated each other. The great tradition was eating itself, just more slowly and with better documentation than the Chinese version. Xuanzang realized that bringing back texts wouldn't be enough. He needed to bring back the ability to read them properly, interpret them accurately, and reconcile the schools that everyone else had given up on reconciling. He needed to become not just a translator but a bridge, which meant, among other things, proving he was worth listening to. King Harsha ruled most of northern India with an enthusiasm for Buddhism that occasionally veered into the coercive. When he heard about the brilliant Chinese monk at Nalanda, he did what powerful men do when they encounter interesting things. he demanded possession. Xuanzang was summoned to Kanauj, Harsha's capital, for a grand assembly. The invitation wasn't optional. Neither, as it turned out, was the scope of what awaited. 18 days. Thousands of scholars from every Buddhist school and several Hindu ones, the greatest philosophical minds of the subcontinent, gathered in one place to debate, discuss, and determine who actually understood enlightenment correctly. King Harsha, with a showman's instinct, had decided to turn theology into spectacle. Xuanzang was placed at the center of it. His thesis, developed through years of study, argued for a synthesis that reconciled the major Buddhist schools. The Madhyamaka and Yogacara traditions, which had spent centuries disagreeing about the nature of emptiness and consciousness, could be understood as complementary rather than contradictory. It was a bold claim. It was also, to the partisans on all sides, borderline heretical. The debates went on for nearly 3 weeks. Challenger after challenger rose to demolish the Chinese interlopers' arguments. Scholars who had spent lifetimes in their traditions deployed every logical and textual weapon available. The crowd swelled. The stakes climbed. King Harsha, delighted by the entertainment, offered a standing bounty to anyone who could refute Xuanzang's position. No one could. By the assembly's end, Xuanzang had done something almost unprecedented. A foreigner had become the most celebrated Buddhist scholar in India. Harsha honored him with titles usually reserved for native masters. Rival schools sent representatives to acknowledge his arguments. The monk who'd snuck out of China as a criminal had become, against every reasonable expectation, a continental celebrity. Harsha, like every other ruler Xuanzang had met, tried to make him stay forever. Xuanzang declined, politely, but immovably. His purpose had never been to collect honors in India. It had always been to bring knowledge home. The return journey began with 657 Buddhist manuscripts, 150 sacred relics, statues, gold, and a small herd of elephants to carry it all. Somewhere in the crossing of the Indus River, one elephant drowned, taking 50 manuscripts with it. Xuanzang nearly turned the entire caravan around to return to Nalanda and recopy the lost texts. He was talked out of it. Barely. The remaining 607 manuscripts continued west, carried by surviving elephants and a monk who had been gone from home for 14 years and was finally heading back. In 645, a letter arrived at the Tang court from the western frontier. It was from Xuanzang, and it was, essentially, a confession. The monk explained that he had violated imperial law 16 years earlier by crossing the border without permission. He acknowledged that the penalty for this crime was death. He requested, with appropriate humility, that the emperor either pardon him or, failing that, at least allow him to donate his manuscripts to Chinese monasteries before his execution. Emperor Taizong's response was not what anyone, including possibly Taizong himself, might have predicted. The same ruler who had banned westward travel, whose decree had made Xuanzang a criminal, sent back a message that was less pardon than invitation. Come to the capital immediately. Bring everything. The emperor would like to meet him. The journey through China's interior became a triumphal procession. Word spread ahead of the caravan. The monk was coming back, and he was bringing wonders. People lined the roads to see him pass. local officials competed to host him. Monasteries sent delegations. By the time Xuanzang reached Chang'an, the streets were so crowded that his escort couldn't move. The same border guards, or their successors, who would have executed him 16 years ago, bowed as he passed. The arrest warrants that had once circulated with his description were treated as embarrassing relics of a less enlightened time. The criminal had become a hero through the simple expedient of bringing back something everyone now wanted. Taizong received him at court with honors usually reserved for conquering generals. The emperor, a practical man with practical questions, was less interested in Buddhist theology than in what Xuanzang had seen. The Western kingdoms, the trade routes, the political alliances, the military capabilities of potential enemies, all of it. The monk had accidentally become China's best intelligence source on Central Asia, and Taizong wanted a full debrief. Xuanzang provided it. He also provided something more lasting, the manuscripts that would transform Chinese Buddhism, the relics that would inspire veneration for centuries, and eventually, at the emperor's request, a detailed account of his travels that would become the primary historical source for 7th century Central Asia. The texts he'd carried across deserts and mountains and nearly died to retrieve were suddenly priceless. The empire that had forbidden his journey now couldn't build translation facilities fast enough. Xuanzang spent his remaining 19 years doing what he'd always done best: reading, translating, and refusing to accept that anything was impossible just because everyone said so. The translation project was staggering. Working with teams of scholars, he rendered 1,335 chapters of Buddhist scripture into Chinese, more than any translator before him, more than any translator since. The Yogacara texts he championed became foundational to East Asian Buddhism. The logical traditions he introduced reshaped how Chinese thinkers approached argument and proof. His translation choices, his terminology decisions, his interpretive frameworks are still being studied and debated today. His travel account, written at Taizong's request, became the definitive source for understanding 7th century Central Asia. Historians studying the Silk Road kingdoms, archaeologists excavating ancient cities, linguists reconstructing dead languages, all of them eventually find their way back to Xuanzang's meticulous notes. The monk who'd set out to answer theological questions accidentally created one of history's great works of geography. And then, centuries later, someone turned his life into a comedy. Journey to the West, published in the 16th century, is one of the most beloved novels in Chinese literature. It features a fictionalized Xuanzang traveling to India with a magic monkey, a pig demon, and a river monster. The historical monk is barely recognizable beneath the fantasy, but his name carries the story. His journey became myth, then legend, then entertainment. The scholar who'd agonized over textual accuracy would probably have had complicated feelings about being upstaged by a monkey with a magic staff. But perhaps that's fitting. Every age takes what it needs from the past and reshapes it accordingly. What endures beneath the fiction and the veneration and the scholarly apparatus is something simpler. A man decided the rules were wrong. He broke them anyway. He suffered for it, nearly died for it, and spent 17 years in exile because of it. Then he came back with something so valuable that the same authority that had condemned him begged for what he carried. The guards who would have killed him bowed instead. The emperor who had banned his journey funded his translation bureau. The crime became a heroic quest, retroactively, because the reward justified the risk. This happens more often than institutions like to admit. Someone breaks the rules, gets something everyone wants, and watches as the punishment transforms into praise. The disobedience was wrong until it was visionary. The criminal was a criminal until he was a pioneer. Xuanzang died in 664, still translating, still teaching, still asking questions that most people had stopped bothering with. His manuscripts survived. His translations spread across East Asia. His route is still retraced by scholars and pilgrims and tourists who want to touch, however briefly, the path of someone who refused to accept that impossible meant anything. He proved something that every rule breaker hopes is true, but can never quite confirm until after the fact. That sometimes the right thing and the permitted thing are not the same. That obedience and wisdom don't always overlap. That history is written by those who return, and what they carry matters more than how they left. The sand of the Taklamakan still blows. The Pamers still kill the unprepared. The borders still exist, somewhere, between what's allowed and what's necessary. Xuanzang crossed them. He kept walking, and eventually the world rearranged itself to pretend it had wanted him to go all along.